Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. You are listening to one Evan Buck, and as always, I'll give my customary show introduction. Hey, everyone, how's it going? It's your boy, Evan. Joining me tonight in our adventures down the Nile River is my good co-host and friend, Chris Coppola.
Hi, good people.
And with that, we now officially have an episode, and I will be kicking over to Chris to be the main point of contact for developing the fork for us today. But I gave a little hint already about going down the Nile River. And if you hadn't already gathered from the show title and episode art and description, well, the surprise will be spoiled once Chris starts launching into the topic.
I am going to launch into the topic. I'm going to be perfectly honest. We did kind of discuss what we were thinking about for art and for the title. No, you don't see this coming. You I kind of want everybody out there. Please pause the podcast right now. Based upon the episode art and the title and the fact that the Nile River is involved.
Right. Where do you think this is going?
Go on Discord and try and sound off and predict what this is.
Yeah. Wrong answers only.
No. Honest answers. Honestly, what you think this is going to be about. It will likely be wrong. But honest answer.
Yeah. No, I'll be quite interested to see what happens. But yeah, where are we actually going, Chris?
We are going to the Sudan in basically 1898. This is, you will often see people writing about the Anglo-Egyptian army. This is right after basically the period of the construction of the Suez Canal. The British come in, take over the administration of Egypt. It is still kind of an independent country. It is also very much run by the British. And during this period, there is an uprising. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to say upriver, even though it is actually down on a map that always confuses people. I don't know why most rivers actually line up like this, but Nile doesn't. There's an uprising upriver in what is, I guess, what I was raised to call the Sudan in school. It was considered the Sudan. It is now technically where we're going is South Sudan. We'll wind up.
Yeah.
And basically after the British took over Egypt, there was a revolt in southern Egypt up the Nile River in what is today Sudan, led by somebody calling themselves the Mahdi. It is basically today referred to as the Mahdist revolt, not modest as in
like Yeah.
Um,
It's Mahdi, I believe, if that's the right
and
spelling.
yes, and it's really interesting to look at who this was because it's kind of like Islamic millenarianism.
I was gonna say I remember hearing about like the Mahdi and all of that when I have studied like Islamic eschatology and stuff. And so I was gonna ask if that had anything to do with it, and
It,
sounds like it
it
does.
it definitely does. It definitely was kind of the inspiration of it. Basically, the to not okay. I'm gonna do what I always do. I don't care. Jump around the
Go
world.
for it.
It's a little similar to so the Taiping Rebellion in China. It's very similar because it's almost the semi-Christian equivalent of it, where this person rises up and says, I am the promised next savior, next disciple of God in this kind of chain. Gather around me and help cleanse our land of all of these bad things going on. Almost exactly what the Mahdi is saying. Um, Mahdi starts a rebellion. It is put down by the British Army. Um, at the basically it's broken up and defeated at the Battle of Omdurman, which is kind of capital of Sudan, Khartoum area, beginning of September. Um,
Initially, when you said that to me in the pre-podcast, I thought you were talking about the Battle of Alderaan in Star Wars. And I'm like, this is quite an interesting contrast to think about like Sudanese huts, like in a Star Wars battle conflict. That was kind of an interesting visual to me. But anyway, I
yeah,
digress.
I'm also thinking about like there is very clearly an empire involved here.
Oh yes. Much different context.
Yes. Um, and in the period immediately after the defeat of the Mahdists at Omdurman, the British Army is kind of spreading out into the extents of the Sudan into South, what is today South Sudan, chasing the remnants of this army, just trying to make sure we captured all of them, we've beaten them. This is
They're basically going on mop-up duty.
yep. And so they are going downriver. They're going to a. By the way, at this point, I'm actually going to tell you where we're going. Fashoda. Um, if you don't know yet, let me tell you what happens there. Uh, for some reason, and it makes a little bit more sense. We can get into that. Um, at this place called Fashoda, the French are there for some reason. Um, what the French are actually doing there is, and we talked a little bit, we could talk a little bit more about the scramble for Africa. This is kind of the last of it. This is the last areas where no European has spread their paint yet. Um,
Yeah.
and what's going on here is the French have come basically east from the Sahel, from sub-Saharan Africa. Picture today's Chad slash Central African Republic, have come across and are trying to lay claim to South Sudan with the idea of reaching the Red Sea slash Djibouti, where they already have colonies there. So they're trying to establish an east west belt. At the same time, the British are establishing a north south belt. This is where both those things hit. Um, in our timeline, they're actually kind of cordial with each other, all things considered. They sit down, they talk. Eventually, it is settled by the governments in Paris and London, and it's forgotten. Um, the fork we're going with here is that basically the British Empire was not exactly known for the ask questions then shoot policy. They got reports that the Mahdists were set up in this fort at Fashoda. It's perfectly reasonable that if they see anybody there, they start shooting.
Yeah, shoot first, ask questions later.
So if they do that, they're going to wipe out this French exploration force. But what does that do? So, Evan, you want to kind of jump in with some?
Yeah, just some overall thoughts on where things might go from here. And just to backtrack just a little bit on the what did, I do think it's kind of interesting, like basically the on the ground conditions were, comparatively very chill. Um, like there was basically an agreement between the generals, while they were drinking whiskey, they're like, hey, we'll just fly all of our flags. We'll fly the British, the Egyptian, and the French flags at this fort. Like, we're holding hands, singing Kumbaya. We're not going to do anything. It is somewhat of a diplomatic crisis back in Europe, but ultimately it's resolved pretty amicably. France backs down, and this essentially gives the British their north to south belt that they were looking for, because if you remember, they also hold Kenya and Uganda at this point. So the British basically get what they want diplomatically in our timeline. In the alternate timeline, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens as a result of the British getting what they want, but with the use of force. And I think most of the downstream implications of this are really going to be cropping up more in the lead up to the Great War. But it's interesting to think of like this alternate timeline being one where we kind of see more of the ripple effects from the absence of something. And I think the biggest absence that we're going to have lacking in this alternate timeline is the lack of the Anglo-French Entente cordiale. In other words, the thawing of relations, and not just the thawing, but actually the establishment of a friendship between two age-old enemies. Like we're talking like for almost a millennium at this point, the British and the French have not been friends.
So, I by the way, I just have to point this out, and there we go. I'm a little surprised that I'm the one that brings America into this as early as I did. Does Fashoda sound a lot like Fort Necessity to you?
It does to me. Yeah, actually, now that you mention it, it does. And for those who don't know, Fort Necessity is when a British officer, George Washington, he's trying to learn how to tow the ropes and inexperienced, and leads to big British defeat, against the French and the Indians.
But it's also like this is French territory, or so they think.
Right.
They show up there, and then all of a sudden there's these other people there. Yeah. They don't quite know why. And it goes one way at Necessity. It goes very much another way here, being in our timeline at least, they like actually didn't shoot at each other. Easily put out.
Yeah. Well, and it is funny you mentioned America First, because I was thinking of mentioning it later on in this episode with other events that were happening around this time, but you beat me to the America punch, so I'll accept that for now.
But so the first thing to think about is we agree that basically this isn't necessarily going to escalate the way Fort Necessity did.
Right. I like, this isn't going to be something where the Great War gets started like 14 to 16 years earlier. Like, no, I think this is something where it's a small skirmish. The British win very convincingly, very handily, and it ends up staying pretty localized with an outcome that's similar to what we got through peaceful means in our timeline.
But the British remember it, and the French remember it.
Oh yeah,
it's not a footnote the way it is in our timeline.
Yeah, exactly.
So we kind of started talking and wondering, okay, this is kind of where things start getting busy. Um, Basically, like I- for a lot of people, they kind of think, okay, Waterloo almost like pushes Waterloo's like a pause button, and they wake up when the Great War happens. This is when a lot of those like tremors that are starting that people trace to the Great War.
Mm-hmm.
But why don't you go ahead when we were thinking about what's all of these other moving pieces all over the world, go ahead and think about how America gets in. What's
Yeah.
going on?
Yeah. Well, so at this point, you know, 1898, 1899 time frame, there's some very interesting things that have already happened in the lead up to this. And what in the pre-podcast, I was, Googling time frames on this specifically to understand and know for sure whether this happened or not. But the Spanish-American War, for example, has already been completed, already been done and dusted. Sometimes I forget how short that war was.
I believe it. I want to say it isn't signed. No,
I'm pretty sure if I remember right. So for a little slice of time, it's actually happening concurrently. Like this whole Fashoda incident and the aftermath is happening at the same time as the end of the Spanish-American War. But I'm pretty sure the Spanish-American War ends first, if I
yeah,
remember right.
but if I'm seeing it correctly, the treaty is in like August, so it's a month before this happens.
Okay. Interesting. Yes. So we have, you know, McKinley is still in office. McKinley doesn't get assassinated with Roosevelt replacing him until 1901. But McKinley is definitely of that, you know, more of that aggressive, expansionist American sort of sentiment. Uh, the Spanish-American War, the Philippines, Cuba, all of that. America is kind of starting to assert itself more on the world stage. And you might be wondering, well, okay, why are we talking about and throwing in America in at this particular juncture with the Spanish and Southeast Asia? Like, what relevance does that have? Well, the reason why it's relevant is because there's also some other interesting happenings going on with other powers around the same time in the region of Southeast Asia. And they also might happen to be British and French as well, and Russian and Japanese. Um,
And German and Italian and Austrian, I believe. I think those are the big ones. I
yeah,
might be leaving somebody out.
was
I
Portugal? Portugal was involved here too, I think.
I think so. I think
Yeah,
Portugal, maybe the Netherlands.
they end up
Just
getting Macau. So, I mean, the Dutch East Indies are a thing.
yeah.
So, yeah, and Germany has a slice of Papua New Guinea, I think, at this point. So, but there's a lot of stuff going on from
Um,
in this general neighborhood.
talk about that. What is that? What is going on?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not really necessarily sure where to start because there is quite a lot happening. Um,
So this was one of those things. Just all right. This is what's going on here for sure. We had that. Let's make sure we understand the orientation of everything else going on, and what I was just talking about was the Boxer Rebellion.
yes,
Basically, after the Taiping Rebellion, there's maybe 20 years off. Then there's another rising. This is actually almost the exact opposite, if you can imagine, of the Taiping, because they are very much going after, like,
they're
Taiping
very
Rebellion,
militantly anti-Christian.
very militantly
Yeah,
anti-Christ.
and I mean, every
And
time you mention the Boxer Rebellion on the show, I just got to say the actual name of the rebel group has to be name dropped. The Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists. Such an awesome name.
I
It's
mean,
so cool.
it is. It is a good
Yeah.
name.
Yeah. But anyway, they shortened it to Boxer.
Basically, they go in and start massacring all the Europeans they can find. Generally, at this point, in China, most of the Europeans you can find are probably going to be missionaries. Lay siege to kind of the international quarter in Beijing. And like I said, Europe comes a knocking. And it is literally somehow every single European power finds a way to, and Japan, by the way, they're also there, finds a way to set aside all of their competing claims and everything to go kick in the teeth of the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fist.
Yep.
Nothing's going to change that. That's still right around the corner, and very much Europeans are not okay with massacring missionaries.
I mean, yeah, if there's one thing that all of these competing interests and nations can agree on, it's let's not have our missionaries get massacred, and let's not have any native-led uprisings threaten our interests.
By the way, I do want to say, I think the bigger one is let's not have any native-led uprisings.
That's the bigger, of course. Really, the kind of the
Japan
missionary thing is kind of like the stated cover reason, I would say.
Well, I mean, the reason I want to think about that is like Japan was also a big part of it. Not exactly Christian friendly.
Not exactly a Christian nation in the slightest, no. But it is interesting that we mentioned this because in our timeline, this is kind of the start, I would say, of, strengthening ties between what ultimately ends up to and a lot of people don't remember this, but like the Japanese were actually on the Allied side in World War One, in the Great War. And in the lead up to the Great War, a lot of what happens, like with the Russia-Japanese War, for example, 1904, 1905, which is not too long after these events, Britain and Britain and Japan have already signed like this. I think this is around this time. Maybe I'm not completely certain on the time frame. But they've already signed like this whole friendship treaty thing. They start kind of becoming, closer together. So,
I mean, if you look at the history of what happened during the Russo-Japanese War, another shout out to Lions Led by Donkeys. You guys need to listen to that episode about the Cursed Fleet. I mean, it's amazing. Why do they have to go all the way around Africa when the Russian Navy in the Far East is attacked and neutralized at Vladivostok? And the Russians send the Baltic Fleet way over in Europe has to go all the way around Africa because Britain says you cannot use the Suez Canal because you're going against our friends in Asia, the Japanese that are basically keeping an eye on you so that you don't come south through Central Asia and threaten Afghanistan/India.
Yeah. And so all of this is to say, I guess, is that we not only have a much different, interesting history with regards to like British-French relations and the lead up to the Great War and World War One, like in the sense that everybody would imagine or think of. Because by the time of the Great War in our timeline, Britain and France are allies. They are both naturally distrustful of Germany. And in the alternate timeline, of course, that's going to be a little bit different. And we'll flesh that out a little bit later in this episode. But we're going to be focusing on Asia right now, which, by the way, I think it is interesting that we basically start off this episode in Africa, in Sudan, and then we're basically like, okay, you know what? Now let's just go everywhere else.
With a detour to Pittsburgh. We stopped in Pittsburgh for a little bit.
Yeah. And we will get back to Africa eventually. But suffice it to say, most of the interesting implications of this event really have most of the reverberations outside of Africa. But we will get back to home base eventually. So, but if we don't have, so getting back to Asia, if we don't have like, the British and the French kind of being more natural allies, I still think the British and the Japanese are going to be, strengthening their ties, strengthening their alliance.
They
And
have
so,
the same enemy. That's the key. They
right,
both are very scared of Russian expansion.
exactly. hmm And so, Chris, I think you presented something very fascinating, um, with the British and the Japanese in the pre-podcast. And how about I think this is the perfect time to kind of start setting that up a little bit. We might
Not at all.
I think what I was just going to say is, yeah, we might have to backtrack a little bit and set up
Exactly.
more before we get to that point. But Chris, I'll have you start doing the setup for that.
So the reason we jump around the world the way we are right now actually kind of gets back to like the first episode of the podcast I ever did, which was basically what if Annie Oakley accidentally shot Kaiser Wilhelm of
I
Germany?
remember that episode. Yeah, I remember that. I mean, we can
Because
call it we can call this episode like around the world in 80 days. Well, it's like we're around the world in 80 minutes.
well, because what happens basically like before Wilhelm, Bismarck had been very careful to balance European powers. He wants everybody hating everybody else except Germany so that he can just basically pick whoever he wants. Wilhelm comes in and starts upending that cart. And basically, Wilhelm kind of basically takes power 8 years before this, does not renew the reinsurance treaty with Russia. That threatens them and makes them become very close to France. But what you were starting to see now is all of these incidents throughout the world: Spanish-American War, Boxer Rebellion, Boer War, Fashoda. There's a couple of incidents in Morocco. The entire history of the Balkans for about 10 years there.
Yeah.
All of it just keeps pushing. It just keeps pushing Europe into two different camps. That is
Right.
not where they were. But in this scenario, the British are afraid of the Russians. The Germans are afraid of the Russians and the French. The British have fought the French in the colonial world, and by the way, are in constant contact and competition with them in the colonial world. So it makes actually a lot of sense. We're talking a little bit in like the 1906, 1907, 1908 period where Britain looks at Germany and says, no, they're the biggest threat to us. So let's bury the hatchet with France/Russia. In this scenario, they don't.
Nope.
So Britain is afraid of France. And one of the things they do, it is a little weird that I mentioned Fort Necessity, because what war did Fort Necessity start?
The 7 Years' War.
Kind of,
Or
yeah.
I call the French and Indian War, but we like to call it in this house, we call it the 7 Years' War.
Where this sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it?
Mhm.
Like, basically in this scenario,
History doesn't always repeat itself, but it often rhymes.
Austria is now on kind of the Prussian, German, British side. That's about it. The big ones you still have: Russia and France teaming up on a German power, Britain supporting it's very and basically what we talked about and suggested is Britain wants to stay neutral. Britain doesn't want to have to fight on the continent because Britain wants to make sure that nobody dominates the continent. They want to sit back, let everybody fight each other, and then jump in when somebody takes a channel port.
Well, and not only that, but it's not like at this point they're still going to be super friendly with Germany all of a sudden. Like
Right.
they are going to want to have Germany beat up on Russia and do their dirty business for them. But they're still at this point, France is still someone that concerns them. Germany still concerns them. They just happen to be on the same side against Russia.
It may not even be the same side. It's just that the same people scare them.
Yes, exactly. And so that leads to some very interesting scenarios and shenanigans. And this was kind of what I was implying and leading to. And then I realized, Chris, you needed to set up all this backdrop in order for this bomb to make sense. But with the British and the Japanese getting closer with each other, there is a neighbor to the Chinese, which we think that...
No.
Oh?
No, haven't talked about Schlieffen yet.
Oh, that's true. We need to develop that as well. By the way, guys, in case you couldn't already tell, I'm letting Chris vamp a lot on this episode. I'm kind of LARPing, and any Gen Z listeners will know exactly what I'm saying. Because being perfectly honest, when Chris suggested this as a topic, I didn't even know that this incident existed or happened. And I'm sure quite a few of our audience, even though they are history buffs, maybe only knew very little about it or didn't even know it existed either. So I am letting Chris kind of set up a lot of this because it's his baby, it's his fork, and it's the Coppola world. We're all living in it.
I mean, if you listen to this podcast, so Britain wants to avoid a continental war, but has friendlier relations with Germany. What that leads to in our timeline, basically when the balloon goes up and the war starts, Germany pulls out their plan, dusts it off, and says, okay, we're doing the Schlieffen plan. Basically, we sweep through Belgium to get around the French defenses because we think the French are a bigger threat to us. We want to beat the French before the Russians wake up. And there's very much this sense of hey, if we take Paris and sign and the French give up, before the Russians sober up and actually realize there's a war going on, that's the only option we have because
you basically got to just go for the full frontal assault, and the only way to be able to do that is to sweep through the Low Countries, and that's what the Schlieffen Plan is. And I saw today online, I saw this very interesting little historical nugget or facet that I didn't know about, and I'll just throw it into the show because why not? The Germans developed a set of artillery that could literally hit Paris from 75 miles away. This is in the 19 teens. You are having to account for the curvature of the earth when you are firing these shells. Was it very accurate? No, because you're basically just firing at some vaguely military target and praying. And
no,
for the most part,
you are firing at Paris.
But you're firing at Paris.
It was called the Paris gun because
they were called the Paris guns.
Got a really good chance of hitting Paris.
You're going to hit something, and the whole point of the matter was for the French to realize that you can be hit from 75 miles away. It was meant to demoralize. It was meant to be severe psychological warfare. Did it work the way the Germans intended? Not really. But I just think it's an interesting facet of history. And it again goes to show what the mentality was in our timeline. And I mean, the Great War playing out the way it did in our timeline with, the trench warfare, just the front essentially being flash frozen for most of the conflict, kind of goes to show that the German understanding of the military situation was pretty darn accurate at the start of the war.
At the start, they missed one thing, and that was that when Belgium was created, all of the European powers got together and agreed that we won't invade Belgium. The British were very worried about the French kind of creeping up the Channel ports and cutting off their access to Europe. They were also worried about the Germans coming over and gaining access to the Channel. And so all of Europe agreed, we have all of our big empires, but we're going to leave Belgium alone. That is why Britain entered World War. Literally, the night before the Germans actually invaded, there was a British cabinet meeting, and the foreign minister told Prime Minister and everybody there, we do not have any treaties with anyone that would require us to get involved in this war. Everybody else has all of these agreements, and we will not get into that. Britain doesn't. The only reason Britain enters the war is because German troops violated Belgian neutrality to invade France. That is a very hard red line for them.
Yep.
We are suggesting that Great Britain, being less disposed to be friendly to the French, because by the way, the Schlieffen Plan was drawn up after like mid 1900s, where Russo-Japanese War happens, where basically the Entente Cordiale happens, where Great Britain is making friendly noises to France. They're not at this point. And I think if they're not, they clearly explain to the Germans, listen, this is a red line for us. If you do this, we will get involved in a way you will not like. And I think if that's communicated, maybe the Germans take another tack. Being basically like, hey, listen, if we play neutral, or if we keep the British neutral, the French are going to have to worry about their empire. France has a long coast and a lot of colonies. And all of those colonies are bordered by red. Basically like the British Empire.
British Empire, yeah.
So if we can keep the British out of it and even just keep the British as a threat to France, that actually ties up a lot of French resources. We've got a short border. We don't have a lot of space actually where we're touching France. It's kind of hilly. By the way, in our timeline, when war starts, the French do try and attack through there. How does that go for them?
Doesn't go very well. There's still French villages to this day that are uninhabitable because of mustard gas and all that stuff.
Like nobody realized it yet, but all of the technology had changed and everything. Defender, if you're coming through a finite frontage, you're not going to do it. You're not making it anywhere. So the idea that, hey, instead of us picking a fight with the British frickin' Empire, just let the French come to us. Because the French are going to have to keep something back, worried about the British. Let the French come to us. We're going to handle it. And basically grab everything you can from the Russians. Plus keep going. I mean, if you look at like what Germany did in the Great War, they had a lot of success on the Eastern Front because it was so freaking big. It wasn't like the same 90 miles, the same place. Because
Well, you have a lot more to
another
work with.
90 miles.
Not only do you have a lot more to work with, but keep in mind, nothing about this changes, in my view. All of the internal strife that is going on in Russia at this point. You have, the Bolsheviks, you have the Mensheviks, you have, the monarchists, you have all this craziness going on in Russia. In our timeline, Germany is able to successfully knock them out of the war. In essence, Russia basically doesn't surrender, but Russia basically says, "Hey, we're out. We're not participating anymore." You know what Chris mentioned earlier about, hey, we can, hit France hard in our timeline. We can hit France hard, conquer Paris before the Russians sober up and the Russian bear gets going. I mean, that's kind of just a military trend with Russia throughout pretty much their entire history. Is if you smack them, you hit them hard, they'll eventually wake up, and the Russian bear will come back and with a vengeance. So if you are going to be picking a fight with Russia, you better, commit to it. You better go all the way. I mean, hey, Napoleon even conquered Moscow at one point, and that still wasn't enough, because they were still able to fight back. So I definitely agree, Chris, with what you are setting up here, which is, hey, we can leave a very defensible position over on the Western Front, just enough to keep the French at bay, and let's go and get as much as we can from Russia and hope that the British can, do whatever they can to distract the French around the world as well, which I think the British would be more than amiable to do. Especially given that they just fought the French at Fashoda in this alternate timeline. They're going to realize that the French are distracted. The French are going to be, pulling a lot of their resources onto the continent. I think this is something that the British see a huge advantage and a huge opportunity in.
If I could also point out another idea, I think if Germany does go against the Russians, the French are going to be under pressure to help to distract the Germans.
Yeah.
They're going to be attacking Alsace-Lorraine, kind of those border areas that are German at this point, just because Germany won the last time. In our timeline, they're going to go back to being French.
Yeah.
Then they're going to go back to being German for about 4 years, and then back to being French.
Mm-hmm.
What's to say the French don't look at this situation and say, hey, there's some miles up there that maybe the Germans aren't defending.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it might be interesting to think if Russia gets desperate, i.e., and by the way, assuming it plays out the way it did in our timeline, where the revolution happens in the same order, once you start seeing the Russians heater, I think it's even possible to think about the French invading Belgium themselves to try and actually get some frontage where you can actually maneuver against the Germans.
Okay. No, that's a possibility that I didn't necessarily think about. And the one thing I would say just against that on a conceptual level is would the French know this? I would assume they would know at a certain point that the British had communicated their desire on Belgium to the Germans before. So why would the French want to necessarily provoke the British in that way?
That's a good question. One, a significant part of the French Navy and to some extent colonial forces have been kept out of the war in Europe to protect against the British.
Mhm.
They're getting nice hands in Algeria. We might as well use them.
Yeah, there you go.
But the other idea is to think about what the to kind of think what the Germans wound up trying to do in our timeline in 1917, which is okay, Russia's collapsing. We're about to have a whole bunch of troops freed up there. So our idea is, and this is actually when they deployed the Paris gun during the
Mhm.
Kaiserschlacht, during the offensive, where they've got all of these troops coming from the Russian front because Russia's collapsing. And they say, you know what? Yeah, if we reopen unrestricted submarine warfare, the United States might get involved.
Okay.
But
Okay, so this is a play. Okay.
we're going to be able to kick, we're going to be able to win the war before they have a chance to do anything. Or just the matter of, yeah, you know what? It might lead to war with Great Britain, but if we don't do this,
Mm-hmm.
we're going to lose the Russians.
True.
Then
Yeah. It's basically a strategic calculation on their part that they have to do something in order to achieve their own objectives. I mean, I could see that as a possibility. I'm not thoroughly convinced, but I can definitely see the argument. One thing I think is interesting to think about as well is harkening back to the Lenin train episode. All right. That still happens the way it does. Germany allowed, essentially, shipped back Lenin for the express purpose of mucking around
yep.
in Russia. Chris, this was an idea that just popped into my head, and I want to see what you think about this. But
Truth
if
in
we,
advertising, by the way, the French invasion of Belgium was one of those ideas that just popped in my head in the middle of talking.
yeah, no, and I think that's actually quite fascinating because that was not something we talked about in the pre-podcast, and I think that's a really interesting, uh, possibility. Again, I'm not completely convinced it happens, but I can definitely see the argument for it. What I do think is interesting to think about, though, an idea that popped into my mind is we already have, in both our timeline, the alternate timeline, uh, Germany more than open to meddling in Russian internal affairs. If we have more of an emphasis on Russia in this alternate timeline, I mean, I don't know how to best explain it, Chris, but I'll just go for the jugular and basically say what I think could happen. You could have a combination of, overt like German military operations and even much more of a covert like funding, propping up. I don't know what the German CIA is called at this point, but we'll just say the Kaiser's CIA is going to be essentially planting Lenin as a German asset, I would say, at this point, and would not only allow him to, just maybe outright win the Russian Revolution earlier, but that would then give the Germans and the Russians the ability to, I don't know, cut some sort of deal, have them be, I don't know if I would say it's a vassal state of some kind or some sort of situation, because I definitely know Lenin would not like that. Um, but essentially, Lenin can become Germany's useful idiot,
Mhm.
you know, and then once his usefulness in toppling and destabilizing the Russian monarchy has been accomplished, then maybe the Germans can roll in even harder and faster. I don't know. I haven't developed it super well. Again, this is something that popped into my head. But what do you think about that being a possibility? Because I think that's quite fascinating.
I think it did happen, and we just forgot about it.
True. No, it did.
Um,
But
it,
in
it
the backdrop, in the alternate timeline of German military operations being much more present and
Mhm.
fast and furious against the Russians in the alternate timeline, that just opens up some interesting possibilities to
So
me.
I do think it's important to keep this in mind. That is what happened.
Mm-hmm.
One, Lenin was sent to Russia after the first revolution, after the February Revolution, and the Tsar was overthrown. Absolutely happens in this scenario as well. But here's what you need to kind of remember. Brest-Litovsk.
Yeah.
Basically, Germany just grabbed tons of stuff. And the only reason that we don't think about that is because when they signed that treaty, Germany itself was 6-7 months from collapsing itself. When it collapses, it leaves this massive vacuum that allows the Soviet Union to kind of fill it back in. If in this situation, Germany is facing a France, maybe distracted, maybe under blockade itself,
Mm-hmm.
and that's it. No British Empire, no United States. They are not on the cusp of collapsing. And
Right.
so they actually are able to take everything that the Soviets were forced to give them at Brest-Litovsk.
Mm-hmm.
So that settlement looks a lot realer to us, I guess is the best way to put it, because it lasts for a lot longer versus Germany claiming it and then having to run back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that's definitely some very interesting possible downstream implications for sure. The Great War definitely looks very different. And I think British involvement, around the world, lack of American involvement, whether or not the French invade Belgium, and that's what gets, the British and the Americans involved as well. But either way, however you look at it, the Great War definitely goes a lot differently. And all of this setup, because I'm kind of the person, and this is usually how it plays out anyway.
You've been trying to get to this one thing.
To this one thing, and I jump ahead to that, and I forget that there's some things that we have to set up first. And Chris is like, wait, 5-yard penalty, redo of downs, kind of thing. We have to make sure we know how to get from point A to D. We got to explain points B and C. And so I think we've explained points B and C pretty well, setting ourselves up for what I had been hoping to get to. And that is back in the Eastern Front, the in Southeast Asia. What I was starting to set up was China has a neighbor, and at this point, it is not called Vietnam. It is called French Indochina. And Chris, I don't know if we said necessarily exactly when this would happen in the timeline. This would be quite interesting if this happened during World War One, but it was my understanding this would happen before then. It would happen like kind of after, either during or after the Russo-Japanese War. But
I think it's basically what I think we're laying out here is it's going to be happening in, let's call it 1917. And the reason I'm suggesting that is we've talked about Europe at war. Call it 1914, the same basic. And by the way, I do understand that that's a big assumption.
It is.
A lot of people are making different kind of calculations if the British and French aren't looking like they're going to be on the same side. But
yeah, I question if the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand either A, happens the same way, and B, is what ends up being the spark that causes the powder keg to explode. But that's neither here nor there.
I mean,
I still think the broad contours of the Great War happen, as it did in similar time frames. It might not be the exact same time frame, but very similar time frame.
And what you have is Japan is tied to Great Britain. So they're not involved in this from the very beginning.
Right.
But call it 1916,
17. Yeah.
in our timeline where Russia just starts collapsing, well, that's when the French get desperate, go through Belgium. That brings in Great Britain. And when Great Britain gets into it, that's when the Japanese get into it.
Mhm.
What do? We are almost at an hour right now.
Yes. Yeah.
What do the Japanese do?
Right. And I didn't want to say the fabled words of as we start bringing this episode to a close, because I know that we could keep talking about this for another 10, 15, 20 minutes. But again, I usually have noted that on both my show, Evan Extemporaneous, shameless plug, and A Fork in Time, usually when I say as we draw the show to a close, we usually have at least another 10 minutes in us. But be that as it may, as we start deploying the landing gear, I guess, we'll open up this whole new discussion point. And that is, if we get the British involved and the Japanese involved, the Japanese are going to be looking not only to take advantage of a weakened and destabilized Russia, but I and Chris both believe that there's going to be British coaching and British support for Japanese meddling with the French.
My only quibble is this: the Japanese need no coaching to take over territory.
They most certainly do not. And I will say, I will freely admit, I was speaking more so from a Eurocentric perspective, who, for all intents and purposes, even though they're allied with the Japanese and are starting to gain more respect for them, they still kind of have some really racist views about them.
The parallel that kind of got me thinking about this was what happened in 1941.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, after the French surrendered, then Japan, nominally allied with Germany, who is nominally allied with Vichy France, invaded French Indochina and took it over.
Yeah.
Somehow. So, like, any kind of instability, and, very much if, like, you're in a situation where Great Britain has gotten involved in this, man, French Indochina, I realize it's on the landmass, but it looks like it's out there on an island.
It's looking like a snack.
It's got no one anywhere near them.
Yeah. I mean, the Kingdom of Siam is right next door, and we've been talking about them recently in another manner, which we won't get into right now, but on another potential fork. But they're an independent country. They're on the doorstep as well. No one really around except for China and an independent country. So, yeah, I think Japan has very much big incentive to kind of start gobbling up more stuff, not just from Russia, but in Indochina, French Indochina as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And the one other thing I think we haven't, two things. One, we kicked to them, we kicked to the United States earlier, but I think it's really interesting to think about, like, if you've got British India, if you've got Japan expanding into Vietnam, Indochina area, does the United States, where is the United States? Because
and that's what I was trying to figure out earlier, because when you mentioned, like, Britain and the US getting involved, my immediate question was, like, on whose side? Like, what is the purpose that the US is serving here?
I wonder if the US gets involved.
That's what I'm curious too.
Side, because I know it is very important for the United States to keep what's called an open door policy in China. We don't necessarily want colonial concessions, but we want access to the market.
We still have the Philippines at this point, so I'm going to say we're probably not going to be super happy with what the Japanese are doing.
I mean, hey, there's a very strong argument to be made that the Japanese occupation of Indochina in August of 1941 led to the American oil embargo,
Yep.
That led to Pearl Harbor.
Right. Hey,
Um,
history might be rhyming once again in an alternate way.
but I think it's a really, it's going to be hard for the United States to know what they feel like, just because
Yeah, because I mean, a lot of sorry to interrupt.
no,
Finish your thought,
but
Chris.
you get back to kind of the 1800 election where you have Americans that view France as the home of Lafayette.
Right. Well, and yeah, I was actually thinking along those lines as well in my mind mentally. I'm like, yeah, we view the French as more natural allies. They helped us during the Revolutionary War. They gave us Lafayette. Um, and the British were our enemies. We just got independence from them.
I think it's interesting though to think one kind of this is a really interesting period in the United States because you have legit ethnic voting blocks. And I
hmm
think it would be interesting if you have kind of East Coast WASP aligned with Midwest Germans
I
on
was
the same side.
yeah. No, that'd be quite interesting. But the thought I was starting to develop was let's contemplate the factors of what led to American involvement in World War One.
Mhm.
We were, kind of covertly supplying, funneling aid to the British and the French. We also had the sinking of the Lusitania, which very much predisposed us against the Germans. And we are coming off of this backdrop of friend of the pod, Woodrow Wilson, being reelected on he kept us out of war. And so to me, as I'm just thinking about American involvement, I think that, there's going to be significant concern about Japanese activities in Southeast Asia. If Britain doesn't get involved until a lot later as the
Well,
result of,
I think,
French
by the way,
noises in Belgium.
it's Great Britain and Japan get involved at the same time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. No, very good point there. Um, I mean, I can see and I like that you mentioned the voting blocks as well, because I can see the argument and the case being made. Like I can see agitation for, hey, we got to help the French, that the home of Lafayette, the home and all these historical ties.
Mhm.
Um, it might be a little harder to make that case if Britain remains neutral until a lot later into the war. But I could see in America getting and being much more focused on the Asian theater, I guess I can say is maybe a good way of putting it, because we have direct interest in that area, in that region.
And,
Um,
and the other thing I'm thinking about is all of your shipment of supplies and funds to Europe to a large extent is because the British are actually fighting a land war,
exactly. Right.
which they're not here. And
But
I
they
think
are not doing in
the
this
other
timeline.
thing of this is if the British don't almost bankrupt themselves, world finance moved to New York in the 1920s because
hmm
of that. It may not.
It very well may not. London may remain kind of like global financial headquarters. And that's something that's quite fascinating that I didn't actually think about. Leave it to you to bring up, I guess, a shade of economic theory.
Hey, listen, I
You
just got
know,
done talking about the open door policy, free
right.
trade in China.
Yeah, exactly. No, for
I,
real.
I,
That
I, I think I don't think the United States has enough of a push to get involved in this. I think it's going to be dealing with a very different world.
in the aftermath. Yeah.
Right.
I think you're right. I think yeah, to me, I just don't see anything that really screams that the US is going to want to fund or support, really either side, I
Mhm.
guess, of the battle lines in this conflict. But they are going to be vested in being, protecting their interests making sure that nothing happens with what they got going on in there. But I think this only further fuels isolationist sentiments, I would say, for sure. And having that persist as a force in American politics for longer. I mean, you mentioned, hey, maybe the New York doesn't become the capital of finance. I'm curious if the Roaring Twenties really doesn't necessarily become as much the Roaring Twenties as it does in our timeline. I mean, I'm sure the Americans are going to be, um, not so much a financial center, but because they're not really touched by the war, like the fact that the British and the French and Germany were so devastated by the Great War is a huge reason why the American financial, economical, hegemon is just able to expand greatly in the post-war years. I mean, at risk of sounding a little dismissive, America is just going to kind of remain another country in the big on the global stage. They're not going to really grow and ascend into the power that they became in the 1920s, and what ends up setting the stage for them to become, let's say one of the big two powers in the Cold War and in the post-World War II era. None of that's going to happen. So we're looking at a very different world, regardless of whatever the outcome is of the actual alternate timelines Great War. And that is a very fascinating question that I think for purpose of this episode, we'll just leave it as a loose thread for now.
I like that. I do want to kind of finish with explaining the title.
Yes, I was just going to say, as we maybe kind of start wrapping up with our remarks here, there has been something that has been burning on my mind and on Chris's mind. We'll finally be able to explain what the episode art and title is all about. So, Chris, take it from here.
So, when we were talking about this incident and we start kind of talking about framing everything else going on around this time, Evans asked me about, well, what's going on with the Spanish-American War, and we talked about that. We talked about the Battle of Omdurman. We discussed the Boer War, which is about to start. It didn't change too terribly much. We didn't talk about it much. And then I happened to point out to Evan, there is one man who basically ties all of this together. And that's Winston Churchill, who I think it would be safe to say Evan probably looked at him as like the prime minister in World War II. Like he was somehow birthed from the sea foam of Dunkirk.
Yeah. I mean, I vaguely knew that he was like a journalist of some kind before he was really into politics, but like, yeah, no, to me, he's one of Poseidon's offspring and just swept into the prime ministership.
But he was a journalist covering the Cuban insurrection against Spanish. Then he actually fought in the Battle of Omdurman. And if you want to read about the Mahdist uprising, his book about it, The River War, is one of the major sources that there is about like the incident we're talking about. He gets done there, and then he goes to South Africa and is captured by the Boers, escapes from there, goes back and runs for office. Hey, by the way, when we were talking on dancing around the British neutrality / if that changes in a blockade on France, who's going to be the first Lord of the Admiralty to actually organize? It's still him.
It's this guy.
it and by the way, I the Ceausescu episode surprised me a little bit with the comments we got, because I do feel the need to say, like, respect to our listeners. Some of you are going to be like, oh yeah. Some of you are going to be a little surprised that he keeps popping up in all of these different places. But basically, it got to the point that I was like, he's kind of like a Forrest Gump. Like he
Yep.
just keeps not even that he. I guess once he's like First Lord of the Admiralty, he is affecting change. He is making the history. Before that, he just happens to be popping up at these places.
Yeah. And
And
also, just to throw this in here as well,
sure.
he wasn't at Fashoda, but he wrote fairly extensively about all of the events that happened after he left the Sudan. And so he wasn't unfortunately there, because that would have been kind of interesting too, having the alternate history Churchill actually make an appearance there. But unfortunately, he actually went back to Vienna immediately afterwards, which that made me think as well about that meme about, all the people who lived in Vienna at one particular point in history, including Mustache Man. But that was in 1913. So Churchill would not have been added to that list of that cast of characters. But I digress.
And the last point to kind of make the episode title make sense. One of the French officers who basically got like a spa weekend with the British, hanging out in Fashoda, waiting for their governments to decide what to actually do. Recalled dining with English officers and drinking whiskey, and his reaction to drinking English whiskey was one of the greatest sacrifices I ever made for my country. Um, as one knows, Churchill was certainly a fan of whiskey, so it all just kind of worked
It
together.
all comes together. I mean, hey, there's a pub near me in San Marcos. Shout out to Churchill's in San Marcos. Great pub. Um, but yeah, I think that's pretty much all that we had to say on this. I think just one small thing I'm gonna throw in, not as necessarily super relevant, but I just think it's kind of funny to mention as long as we're on the subject, and then we'll bring this to a close, is the British just kind of find themselves, regardless of however they try to implement different solutions to simmering conflicts in their colonial empire, it doesn't really go well either way. And the Sudan is no exception to this. They split it between like the more Muslim north and the Christian animist south. And, that led to a lot of conflict and violence. I don't think anything about that changes in this timeline. In fact, I could possibly argue and conceivably see a more definitive, territorial split between the North and the South. We might have seen an independent South Sudan a lot sooner in this alternate timeline. But I just want to bring up this meme of Britain in the 1940s. If you implement the two-state solution in India and Pakistan, what's the result? Massive violence. If you do not implement a two-state solution with Israel and Palestine, what's the result? Massive violence. And so, unfortunately for the British, they're going to go 0 for 3 here, and they'll implement a two-state solution in Sudan. What's the result? Most likely going to be in the aftermath of that in decolonization, still massive violence. Nothing's going to change.
Shout out to certain members I know are gonna hear this. Two-state solution, like trying to break off the 6 counties in Ireland.
You went there.
I did.
Oh man, we're going to hear from them. But anyway, that's all that I had on this topic, and I think that this was really fascinating and interesting, and we were able to begin and end in the neighborhood that touched everything off, but we literally went all around the world in, I think this episode is literally going to be almost 80 minutes. So there we go. The jokes write themselves. But anyway, thank you so much for tuning in to this episode as always. And if you liked what you heard, you agree, you disagree, you just want to talk with other fellow history nerds like us, you know where to go. That's our Discord server. And I'll finish things off with, if you happen to stumble across a fork in the Nile and you have a choice between the White Nile and the Blue Nile, Which do you think we should choose, Chris?
I think you should shoot first and ask questions later, which got us in this situation in the first place.
Yeah, there you go. Por qué no los dos? Just conquer both, because we'll shoot first and ask questions later. But what we usually like to end off with is, if we happen to come across a fork in time, we think you should take it. Thanks so much for tuning in, and have a good one, everyone.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime, or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.